As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
My dream for this book is to change the conversation around adolescence and to weave together the stories and the voices of young people and their parents with the science in the framework that I was developing that really outline how do we, if we're educators, or how do we if we're parents, or how do we if we're professionals or even grandparents or anyone working with teenagers, how do we help them thrive better than we are doing?
That was Ellen Galinsky on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are four experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy-supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, everyone. It's Emily here with Debbie to introduce this episode with famed child development researcher Ellen Galinsky, whose new book, The Breakthrough Years, shares updated science about adolescence that I think offers so much optimism. I had so much fun with Ellen, and I'm hoping the conversation is as interesting to everyone else as it was to me. So what did you think, Debbie?
Well, as the parent of two tween daughters, I have a 12-year-old who essentially is a teenager, and
that counts these days,
right? Yeah, and an almost 10-year-old. And to me, listening to this conversation with Ellen felt like a big exhale. I think adolescence is such a fascinating developmental stage, right? There's so much transition happening. It's really important, exciting stuff developmentally. And as a parent, there's like inherent tensions baked into the transitions that they're going through, and you grapple with these things. But you add in all the buzz about adolescence these days and the mental health crisis and the anxiety and all these things. And sometimes it just feels, I don't know, teenagers get a bad rap, adolescents get a bad rap. And so this conversation felt very grounding to me. I felt like a sense of relief and a sense of positivity. And, it's a breath of fresh air.
I think that's why I enjoyed it so much. I mean, I was really into the conversation because it felt refreshing. Everywhere I turn, it seems like it's more doom and gloom and all these fears about our teenagers these days. And I think there's so much more to the story that we're not talking about. We're so focused on the negative. We're really excluding very important strengths of our teenagers. We talk about this idea of threat versus opportunity. And I think, especially in this current discussion about social media and smartphones, when we're only focused on the threat, we're missing the opportunity. And it's just a setup for negative interactions.
Well, and you talk to Ellen about technology and social media and phones and get her perspective on it, which I thought was a really important one. And as a parent, I think this is an issue we're all trying to navigate effectively and trying to figure out what to do. And there really are some very extreme opinions. And Emily, I think your voice in this space has been, for me personally, a very balanced and grounded one. And I don't know if our listeners know that you have written about this in your Substack newsletter, which is terrific. And you've been really a voice of reason. And you also recently were in a panel debate about this, which I watched. And tell people about this, because it was actually really cool. I don't know if it was for you, but it was really cool to hear your thoughts, your wisdom.
The idea of it is very cool. The reality was very stressful. But I actually recorded the interview with Ellen just a few days before this debate. So it was very much on my mind. And it was sponsored by the Institute of Art and Ideas in the UK. And so it's virtual. There will be a live link available at some point.
We'll link to it on our show notes if it's out by the time this episode comes out.
So I was part of a panel with a well-known headmistress in the UK who's known as the strictest school teacher in Britain, and Jonathan Haidt, who I'm sure if our listeners follow Adolescence at all have heard. He wrote this recent bestseller, The Anxious Generation, and his whole thesis is that smartphones have caused the mental health crisis for our youth. And so, as you can probably pick up, it's a debate. So the whole point was to have different viewpoints, but I was the minority viewpoint of the three of us. So it was a tough position to be in. And it was so reinforcing how important it is for us to get an alternative narrative out there about both teenagers and mental health and how complex both are, and that it's not this straightforward and simple. And one thing I actually took with me from my interview with Ellen into the debate was there is so much positives about the adolescent brain, the state of adolescence today, and we're not talking about it. We're just not giving it airtime. And one thing that adolescents talk about, which Ellen refers to in her research, is how they feel very discriminated against, and that there's prejudice against teenagers. And I think the debate and the way that we were talking about the scariest possible outcomes and fear was really taking over. And I kept trying to bring up, but we need to respect our children's autonomy and help them develop important skills. You know, this is like harnessing the powers they do have and helping them grow in really positive ways rather than responding from a place of restriction and reactivity and fear.
Yeah, fear. And as a parent, I mean, I think especially where it's like, we want to try to do the right thing and it's scary and we get these messages. And what I really appreciated about what you were saying, Emily, is that it's really using things like technology as an opportunity to teach them skills. You're definitely not saying, to be clear, oh, here you go, 5-year-old, have an iPad
right.
queued up to graphic and violent content. And while you're at it,
have a beer.
Right. Take a beer and an iPad and good luck, you know. But it is like kind of this developmentally appropriate process of helping them navigate this world, the reality of the world that we're living in. And there's value in that. And it really ties to your conversation with Ellen, right? It's not like if you come from this fear-based place of like adolescents are a menace to society, we got to crack down on them. It's like they don't get the opportunity and it can be detrimental.
Absolutely. I think one of my favorite parts of the whole experience of getting ready for the debate was actually practicing with my 14-year-old and 12-year-old and hearing their thoughts on this big question. And I think we all need to be doing more of that, of talking to our kids, right? And getting their ideas rather than imposing our kind of paternalistic protection, seeing them as needing protection when maybe they don't. And I just think it was a good lesson. I mean, I'm always talking to my kids. I'm advocating that, but in the debate experience with the other two panelists, I felt a huge difference there where they're also coming from the motive of protecting children, but we see how to do that in very different ways. And I see it as involving our children in decisions and collaboration.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a take-home message of this episode, right? Like, when in doubt, talk to them, get their experience, like hash it out together. You know, there's room for that. There's value in the process of doing that as well.
Absolutely. I'm just so excited we have this episode to share with our listeners. This is just the perfect timing for it, I think. If you enjoy this episode, we will have a link, hopefully, to the debate as well, if you're interested in checking that out. And I would love to hear from our listeners about where they are with teenagers, whether it's parenting or teaching or as a therapist. You know, what's everyone's thoughts on the state of adolescence today? Ellen Galinsky is president of Families and Work Institute. She's conducted research on childcare, the parent-professional relationship, parental development, work-family issues, and youth voice. She also serves as senior science advisor to AASA, the School Superintendent Organization, and as senior advisor to the immediate office of the Assistant Secretary of Youth Mental Health at the Administration for Children and Families, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Ellen is the author of the best-selling Mind in the Making, more than 100 books, reports, and 300 articles. Other highlights include serving as a parent expert in the Mr. Rogers Talks to Parents TV series, as childcare expert on Dr. T. Barry Brazelton's TV series, What Every Baby Knows, being the elected president of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and being elected to the National Academy of Human Resources. In 2018, the Work and Family Researchers Network established the ongoing Ellen Galinsky Generative Researcher Award. She holds a Master of Science degree in Child Development and Education from Bank Street College of Education and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Child Study from Vassar College. A popular keynote speaker, Ellen has been a presenter at 5 White House conferences, including the White House Conference on Teenagers in 2000. She has been featured regularly in the media, including appearances on Good Morning America, The Today Show, and The Oprah Winfrey Show. She's here with us today to talk about her book, The Breakthrough Years, a new scientific framework for raising thriving teens. So, from the White House and Oprah to psychologists off the clock, welcome, Ellen.
It's a thrill to be with you.
I'm so excited to have our discussion today. As we were talking before we started recording, we have a lot of symbiosis in our work and our interests. I think this will be a great discussion. So I want to start with how you, at the beginning, refer to this as a real news book rather than a good news or bad news book. As I read it, though, I thought of it as a good news book with how we think of teenagers. Essentially, and I completely agree with this with my experience, we don't give teens enough credit for the strengths of their unique brain development and all the capacity they have to do and be great things. I perceived a main mission of your book as rewriting a cultural narrative about teens that has trended negative for a long time. So how would you describe prejudice against teens, and what's your argument against these prejudices?
I actually have data that we're negative about teens. I mean, it's not just my opinion. I asked a nationally representative group of parents for any word or phrase that came to mind in describing the adolescent or the teen brain, and only 14% of parents use positive words. So we do have a negative narrative. And there have been other efforts to look at the news about teens, and it's kind of 2-to-1 negative stories or even more to positive stories. I think it's been forever that we've had negative news about teens. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but that is not the way researchers are seeing it. One of the reasons that I called this book The Breakthrough Years is that when I interviewed 45 leading cognitive neuroscientists or developmental researchers, they told me again and again about how they were seeing data differently these days. Forever, people have studied the risks, the negative risks that adolescents take. And one researcher well, many researchers, but I'll just use the words of one, Evelina Kroon from the Netherlands, said she was doing a longitudinal study about adolescence and followed kids over a lot of years. And she said not very many young people actually do take negative risks. And yet the field has spent forever studying that. Why do we do that? And she said they are, primed to go out to explore, to learn. Other researchers said the same thing. We've just seen it negatively. We researchers have seen it negatively. But now that we understand the brain better, it's giving us different evidence. So the real news is about the brain. The brains of adolescents are different than the way they've been portrayed. The experience that led me to ask that question was sitting in a neuroscience conference. And there were a group of scientists arguing about how the public and how parents saw the teenage brain. The analogy that had been used for so many years was like an out-of-control car. Their reward system was fully developed. We're pushing the pedal to the metal. We're full go in the teen years, but the brakes don't work. There's a faulty brake system, a faulty cognitive control system. That's actually a very negative analogy to begin with. And the second thing is that it's not really true. When you go deeply into the neuroscience and look at it, what it shows is that both the cognitive control system and the reward system are developing, that both are learning systems, that there is huge individual differences, and that depends on the context that kids are in, and that this is a time when, I'll use Jennifer Silver's words, it's the superhighways of the brain are being built, and the connections among all of the parts of the brain are developing. And so it's a prime time, just as the early years are, for learning executive function skills. So I think that the narrative has to be rewritten because it's not an accurate narrative.
It's false.
Yes.
And what I'm hoping we'll spend a lot of time on is really understanding the brain, and what we know about the brain more specifically that I found surprising and enlightening. But I think why it's so important is how it translates to how adults treat teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
And if we see them as out of control without their own brakes, that means we see ourselves as we have to do that for them before we even give them a chance to start the car, right? Like we're expecting bad outcomes. And so then we get involved and we don't give them the opportunity to really show us their strengths and skills. And so I think that's where the rewriting of this narrative can really impact real parents and families in what we're expecting of our teenagers.
Well, it has to. I mean, I had the opportunity to play around with the data that I collected, and we looked at the parents who use negative words, and we looked 9 months later to see how that predicted how their kids were doing, controlling for everything we possibly could, statistically. So we took out of the statistical analysis what the negative words that the parent used about their own child, because I had a question about that, both open-ended and then a closed-ended question. We took out the conflict out of the analyses, the conflict that parents had with their own children. So it couldn't be just that they had a difficult child and they were fighting with them all the time. We controlled for things like socioeconomic background. And we looked 9 months later, and that was during the pandemic, a really rough time during our nation's history. And if you use negative words about the average teen brain, your own child was more likely to be lonely or sad or had less hope, or the things that we worry about this generation. If we have those ideas about this generation, we are creating, in some sense, a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Oh my goodness. I mean, this really feeds into what's happening in our current cultural moment. I think as we are painting an entire generation as anxious and having mental health crisis and that they need our protection, when there is data counteracting that narrative as well. And again, we're not integrating the positive news, the good news, the strengths that teenagers bring. And so I'm hoping today we can help shift some of that, starting with the listeners of our podcast, and anyone who reads your book.
I'm so with you.
Yes. So because we're going to be referring to it throughout the interview, as you already have, will you just give a brief background of the Breakthrough Years study?
I practice a form of research called civic science, which means that the people who would be the subjects of a study become its co-creators. So I start with teenagers, and I went out in focus groups and interviews to teenagers, and they weren't just from the United States. And I asked them open-ended questions like, what do you want to know about your own development? Or what should adults know about people your age? Or if you had one wish to improve the lives of people your age, what would that wish be? Just questions that would get at, what they're thinking. And I heard 2 messages from those focus groups. And I went with my grandson in a lot of them, who was my oldest grandson, who was just becoming an adult. He was just in that transition. He was just entering adulthood. So I thought he could listen in ways that would be really helpful. It would be fun to have him with me in the beginning parts of this series of studies. And the things that they said again and again and again were, why don't people understand us? I mean, people have said that forever, and we sort of write it up. Oh, it's just the age. But it's not. We don't really understand them. I know that. And then, why don't people like teenagers? And I went, whoa, now that wasn't what I was planning to look at, but civic science. So that's what I had to look at. That was an exciting adventure story. So the next step after the focus groups was to design a nationally representative study. So representing the young people of our country, all over the country, from 9 to 19, and their parents. And we conducted those studies twice. We went back during the pandemic because we wanted to see how they were doing, and we wanted to see if what we had found out in the first round was predictive of how they were doing during the pandemic. I also interviewed 45 leading cognitive neuroscientists and developmental researchers, not only from the United States, but different parts of the world. And then in between those 2 nationally representative studies, I had asked for anyone who would be willing to do an open-ended interview with me, who would just talk with me on the phone. I don't know who they are. I got a phone number, and people volunteered, the parents and the kids. So I talked to about 60 parents and adolescents from that group of nationally representative people. That's part of the civic science. So you find out this and you go, I'm not sure I understand this. How would they interpret it? So I went back with a lot of questions based on the first study. And then we did a behavioral study in 22 schools in 6 states of 6th, 9th, and 12th graders, looking at executive function and other skills. Those were the studies.
That's huge. And you managed to wrap it all up in a book, along with really drawing on science and research across all of the areas that you get into. So it's really a huge undertaking.
Yeah, my dream for this book is absolutely what you said, to change the conversation around adolescence. And you and I have a lot of work to do to change it. It's pretty entrenched. People love this is the anxious generation kind of story. That just, the media just love that kind of a story. Adolescents don't love it at all. They really fight against it. But my hope was to weave together the stories and the voices of young people and their parents with the science in the framework that I was developing that really outline how do we, if we're educators, or how do we if we're parents, or how do we if we're professionals, or even grandparents, or anyone working with teenagers, how do we help them thrive better than we are doing?
And that starts with how we think about them, right?
It does.
So let's get into some of the specifics, which are so fascinating. One that you sort of touched on, but I want to get back to it, is reframing what we have long considered developmental liabilities, like risk-taking specifically. And you reframe them as developmental necessities that actually serve a positive function. So will you explain how risk-taking can actually be critical to positive development for adolescents?
Yes. The analogy that I want to use, because I have written some books where I have photographed and watched birds and watched what happens when the bird leaves the nest. Just when I was looking at this research, that kept coming back to me. That baby bird has to be pushed a little out of the nest or jumps out of the nest. In one book that I did, there was a skunk, another book, other dangers happened. That world out there isn't as safe and protected as the nest. And this is a transition between moving out from a closer family. Yes, of course, they're out in the world when they're in elementary school, but moving out from a closer family out into the wider world, they need to have a sense of exploration. They need to do that. How else would they ever grow up and become adults in our world? So they need that sense. It's not a liability that they want to explore, that they react very strongly. You know, we've been so critical of the fact that there's, you know, the highs are high and the lows are lows. Adolescents feel things in a way we sometimes feel, but we don't always feel in the way that they so often feel. And, big feelings, very, very big feelings as we talk about it today. It's like an emotional detector that helps them figure out the world. Is this person whom I'm with a good person for me to be with? Is this a safe situation? Does this go along with my values? So they have to have a real, an intense emotional reaction to things, and as they make their way out into the world. This is our biology priming us to move out, to explore, to begin to establish ourselves as a person in a relationship with our parents, but a different relationship with our parents when they're grown up.
Right. That is so helpful to think of those strong and intense emotions that can be difficult to be around at times. Yes. But knowing that it's really serving a function for their learning about their world and their relationships. I think that is so helpful. If just in the real life of being in the room with a teenager who's having a big feeling, to keep that in our heads. You know, it's interesting when you talk in the book about risk taking. I mean, I think our heads immediately go to things like drugs and alcohol and sex, right? But you talk about things that are much more benign that are actually happening with my 14-year-old, which is the love of horror movies and roller coasters. So what is that doing for the brain?
Well, I think here's where researchers were swimming along with the regular culture and seeing adolescence in a negative, at least a risk-taking way. And I think it's important to understand that research is powerful and really good in many ways. But I think researchers have moved beyond it. I think where we need to go is give young people experience with positive risk. That's what we need to do. Every school should be doing that. Every parent should be doing that. So if it's horror movies, that's not bad. That's cool. Whatever it is that is a positive risk. My grandson loves going to gyms and climbing walls. He just loves that sort of thing. He works really hard. And I love what Ron Dahl says about that. He had a different view. There was the thought in adolescence that kids did these dumb things because they just didn't understand the danger. They didn't have the sense of consequence. They didn't feel they were held immune to danger. And that's not true. That's actually not true. What Ron's research and his colleagues found was that the fear parts of the brain were lighting up very strongly when they were doing these kinds of exciting and thrilling sorts of things. So it's not that they don't feel fear. It's not that they don't even understand the consequences. They do. It's that they are learning to be brave. And if we could see it that way, that what they're doing is learning to be brave, and we need to give them lots of opportunities to learn to be brave, what a gift we would be giving them for their lives, because we need bravery and a lot of times in our lives when we're adults.
Do you have more examples of how we can do that? Like, what are positive risks we can encourage for our kids?
Going to new places, meeting new people, taking drama where you have to stand up. A teenager from Florida told me about how the school had a trip away. It was at a camp, and the boys' part was cordoned off from the girls' part. And she was staying in a bunk with her best friend, or a cabin with her best friend and all the popular girls. And her best friend and the popular girls came running out and said, let's go to the boys' side, sneak over to the boys' side. That's a negative risk. But her dad had talked to her beforehand about what would happen if she broke the rules, the rules of this trip. And she could be suspended, and that could go on her record, and that could affect her. But her best friend said, come on, live a little. And she said, I will live a little, but I don't need to do this to live a little. And that's because she was taking drama, and it scared her to death. I mean, to stand up and sing and perform and dance in front of a group of that were largely boys in this particular drama class. And she was in the 7th grade. They were in the 8th grade. They were a year older than she was. And it scared her to death, but that she learned to do that gave her the fortitude of not going to run over to the boys' side of the camp. She didn't need to take that negative risk.
Oh, that's such a great story. It's this paradox. I think parents feel like they need to protect their children from doing bad things by keeping them from going out in the world and exploring more. And so in the fear of, I don't want you going out and drinking and doing drugs, we're actually maybe increasing the risk of that happening at some point because they're not getting those graduated skills along the way.
Right. How do you stand up for yourself if everyone wants to do something and you don't want to do it? We all need to learn that. I mean, I've needed it in my workplaces. I've needed it in my communities. I've needed it in my life many, many, many times.
Right. So it's looking for where are these opportunities to do scary things and be brave in scenarios that are actually safe. Standing up in front of a drama class may be terrifying, but it's safe.
Yes.
There's no physical harm.
Right.
Will come from that.
Yeah. And my kids went with my husband and volunteered for cooking food and taking it to homeless people. That was scary.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really scary.
Yeah.
But it felt good. I think we all have a need to contribute. And part of helping them take positive risks is building on this need to contribute too. I mean, it's a need that we all have to want to not just make the world a better place for us, but to make, particularly in adolescence, to make the world a better place for other people.
Well, and that taps into the experience of connection with community rather than being so focused on the self, part of a greater good rather than my own interests. So it all of that becomes really important.
Exactly.
Any other aspects of the teen brain that you especially want to debunk for us?
I think in the way that and you do this so beautifully in your book, it's in the way that we talk to them. In response to the one wish question that I ask in this survey, if you had one wish to improve the lives of people your age, what would that wish be? And this, anonymous survey taker wrote down all of the things that adults said to her that she felt were diminishing her, were denying her feelings, were not taking her seriously, were not understanding her. So things like, I went through that in your age and it was fine. You can say I went through it at your age and it really felt hard.
Right.
That would be fine. But, it's just not, it's saying it's nothing diminishes her feelings. You'll get over it. Another thing we say, or, don't be such a teenager. Well, you are a teenager.
Right.
It doesn't help you. It's what you are. Just the list of things that we say to try to make it better, and I think that if we as adults in adolescents' lives just focus on protecting them, we're not going to give them the experiences that they need to be able to learn to become adults, which is the task of this age. Who am I? Who am I going to be as an adult? That's the task.
Right. So I want to get into your shared solutions approach. And we discussed prior to recording that we have an overlapping interest in promoting the science of autonomy-supportive caregiving. And this shared solutions approach draws on that science. So will you describe what this approach is and why it's important for teenagers specifically?
Yes. I personally lucked into this before I knew anything about the brain, or I was a teacher before. So I was a teacher of young children, and there was one kid in my class. It was in New York City, and we used to go to the park, and there was another teacher there. I wasn't by myself, but Isabel, and that's her real name, always climbed to the top of the jungle gym when it was time to leave the park. And so what do you do? How do you get her down? Do you climb up there and pull her down? That's probably not going to work, even though you're an adult and she's, a 4 or 5 year old. And so I just had a meeting in the group with how to, instead of saying, here are the rules and this is what you do, I did, autonomy support is always sharing the rules. So you're going to have to leave when we leave. I'm not going to be leaving you there alone, as Isabel. But so what ideas do you have here? We have a problem. The other kids need to get back. You're up on the top of the jungle gym. What ideas do you have for solving this problem? And then there's no stupid idea. You could write down, leave her at the park. You can write all of them down. And then you do perspective taking. What would work about this for everyone else and for me as a teacher? And what would work about this for, in this case, Isabel? And that worked really well. We came up with a plan for how to deal with it when she didn't want to leave the park, that the whole group was a part of and that she was a part of, and that worked. So when I had my kids, now sort of flash forward, and my kids are fighting in the backseat of the car because I'm taking them to work with me. And so I live in the country. I worked in the city. They're in the car because they're going to school in the city where I am. And they're fighting. And it's dangerous driving on the highway with two kids, now they're elementary age, fighting in the backseat of the car. So we had a family meeting. And out of that, I developed a process that I now know is autonomy-supportive. And the process is you first state the problem and the rules. You can't fight in the backseat of the car because it's dangerous. And that's the rule. I can't be distracted from driving because I'm on a 4-lane highway. I need to be able to focus on driving. And then you say, what ideas do you have? So that's the first, is stating the rule or the goal. And then the second is just brainstorming as many solutions as possible. We would write them down in our family because it really worked to cut the sniping in a sense. So any idea was okay. You couldn't criticize anyone else's idea, and everyone would participate. But I particularly wanted the kids to generate ideas because I wanted them to come up with the solutions. That really worked. I know as a boss that if I just start telling people what to do, or someone is just always telling me what to do, we all have a need for some autonomy. I know from my research on the workforce and workplace. And then you evaluate the solutions. That's the third step. Then you say what would work for each person involved. So you're perspective taking. And then you say, well, we're going to need to pick a solution that works best for me, the parent, and for you, the kids. So come up with your solutions. And then you pick one to try, but you call it an experiment. You don't call it a final solution because it's going to work for a while and then it probably won't work anymore. But the point is the process. The point is that you're giving them problem-solving skills to handle tough situations when they're out there in the world. So my kids came up with, they would each get a bag of things that they like to do in the car. And then that worked for a while, but then it didn't work. And then they decided that they would have a pillow between them, and that worked for a while. And then it didn't work because they would push the pillow and it would touch the other one. And then they decided that they were actually going to do something together rather than try to do things apart. And they got a tape recorder with a microphone, and they, instead of listening to the radio, they did their own radio shows, and that worked for a while. And then they were grown up, and
And they finally grew out of it.
Yeah, they finally grew. They don't fight in the backseat of the car anymore. They're grown-ups.
Well, what I love about this is there's so much here. Obviously, that's embodying the autonomy supportive approach. And not only do they feel instrumental in coming up with solution and using critical thinking, it also reduces the pressure on the parent. And as the parent, you're sharing then with your child, how are we going to fix this problem? Rather than feeling that pressure to, how am I going to stop their fighting? It's driving me crazy. How can we work together to stop the fighting?
And I think a conflict, again, reframing, can be a skill building opportunity. So what I was trying to do was to give my kids skills to solve conflicts, because it won't just be with their brother or sister. It will be with the other kids in their class, with the my son teaches. It would be with someone that he's teaching. He's a musician. It could be with a group that, his ensemble. It could be my daughter in her workplace. I think of 2008 as one of the pivotal times when this researchers who were studying kids' development began to give it a name. And earlier, for people who were using self-determination theory, that they knew the importance of autonomy as a basic psychological need. And so they came up with it earlier, but in early childhood, it came through a different route and a different set of researchers. But it fits the research beautifully.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So you had an instinct there.
Self-preservation. Drive my kids and keep them safe.
We talk a lot on our podcast about the growth mindset because it's part of healthy psychology. But you expand on this concept by talking about a possibilities mindset versus an adversity mindset. Could you describe each and why they're important to understand for the parent-child relationship?
I love Carol Dweck's work. Totally admire it. I did not set out to find another mindset. What I set out to do in the interviews that I had with in between the two nationally representative studies was I wanted parents to walk me through a time when they lost it. Because I know that you can know what to do. You can know that you want to be autonomy supportive, but you're not in the moment. You say, shut up. Don't fight. You'll never watch television again. You'll play with no one in your whole life, whatever it is. I'm taking away all your electronics for a year, whatever things we say when we're upset. So I asked them blow by blow, your child did this, you felt this, you thought this. How did you respond? What happened next? How did you feel? What did you think? How did you respond? And I discovered that there are three things that were around actually being able to be the kind of parent, or I would say teacher or professional that you want to be. The first is the growth mindset. Things will or won't change. The second, and this is in a lot of Carol Dweck's work, I have a slightly different name for it, which is it's whether you see something as a threat or whether you see it as a challenge. And I found that if you saw it as a threat, you went into a fight or flight kind of a response. If you saw it as a challenge, you felt that you could figure it out. So it's leaning into stress. It's understanding stress. And there's been some wonderful new research about stress is enhancing. So I think what the possibility mindset does is help kids learn how to lean into stress. If you're teaching this to kids and if you're using it yourself, it's leaning into stress. And the third is self-efficacy. I think I can figure this out. I don't know what I'm going to do right now, but I think I can figure it out. I have the belief that I can make this work. So there are three parts to a possibility mindset versus an adversity mindset. Things can or can't change. It's a threat versus a challenge. And I can't figure it out, or I can figure it out. And we have found, now we're teaching it to teachers, and we found it highly, highly predictive of whether or not they're doing well as adults, and whether they're using a skill building kind of an approach. So it turns out to be way more important than I thought in just the early testing that Phil Zalazzo of the University of Minnesota and I are doing in testing this out. So we're going to continue to develop this. I think we're onto something that's very exciting.
Well, and features of that really work against the development of anxiety. And we were talking about the anxious generation earlier. But the idea of stress is not something scary to avoid, and that I have mastery. I can make a difference in this adverse situation. That is the opposite of anxiety.
Yes, you would call it, and I love the way you do this in your book, you would call it a fear-based approach. We're not operating from fear. And so, we're all going to have setbacks in life. We can't avoid them. We can't protect our children from them as much as we'd like to. That's a natural desire. I understand that desire, but we really need to move in a different direction if we want to help our children become the people and adults that we would hope they could be.
And that are healthy, healthy functioning adults.
Yes.
Well, I want to zero in on some stats about the parent-child relationship with teenagers, because I think that's another myth, that you are just going to fight all the time and you're going to hate each other and it's terrible until they grow out of it. But you found some good news here. Conflict is actually much less frequent than we think. And I want to highlight 96% of teens in your study reported getting along at least somewhat well with their parents. And 67% indicated getting along very well with their parents. Only 4% said not too well or not too well at all. So this is really different from what we might expect as a parent going into adolescence. What would you tell parents about how to gauge how well the relationship is going with their teen?
Well, I'd like to just step back for 1 second and talk about that finding. That's why I love research. It's an adventure story. You don't know what you're going to find. We ask parents, and we use the standardized measure of conflict, parent-child conflict. And we ask, from the eye rolling to the silent treatment to the actual big out fights and stuff, how often they happen. And we ask in the same family, both the parent and their adolescent, and found that it was a lot less frequent. It was way on the doesn't really happen very often side than happens all of the time side. I think when it happens, it has an emotion that is bigger than the incident and it stays there. So it could be that one fight and we had, not very many fights all week. And some people have a lot of fights, there's a huge variation in there. But on average, it's not as conflict laden.
What would you tell parents about how to gauge how well the relationship is going? So instead of getting too focused on the emotion of that one big fight, there are other ways we can think about, okay, like how often are we fighting? You call it disclosure frequency too, right? Like how often is my child actually sharing things with me? And how well supported is my child feeling?
I ask kids how to describe successful parenting. And the word was open communication, open communication, open communication, open communication. That's the way they would describe success. So I think that's the way we should think of success too. They're not going to come and tell us everything all of the time. And sometimes
they shouldn't. They should. They need their privacy, right? They need their inner lives.
Right.
But we don't want them to feel like they can't tell us anything.
Right. Or that we would just judge them so negatively and disapprove of them. So I think that my barometer would be, do they from time to time tell us things that it's a little hard for them to tell us? And do we react in a way that makes them want to tell us the next time? I guess that would be my judge. And also, can they tell us things about themselves, about ourselves that aren't working for them? And we listen respectfully. They have to tell us respectfully. In my family, that you can't tell me that I've done something, that's ridiculous in a mean, obnoxious way. You have to tell me nicely. If you need to write me a letter, go ahead, write me a letter. You have to say it in nasty ways, but I will listen. And I got that from my mother. My mother was open to hearing when I thought what she was doing wasn't right. I didn't know that was unusual. You only know your parent.
Right.
And so when I would spend the night out and see how different it was, I would go, whoa, I lucked into a parent. I'm really glad I got the one I got. So I wanted my kids to feel that way about me. And so they were always free, and they still are, to tell me when they don't like what I'm doing.
Well, and now you're spending part of your life's work helping all teenagers. So that is a beautiful legacy from your mother's parenting.
Yeah. And my daughter's helping me. So there you go. My son too. Yeah. So we're extremely close now as adults. I'm really grateful for that because they're totally cool, wonderful people I like to be around.
Well, and that's what we're hoping for when we're parenting, right?
Yeah,
is that we get to that point in adulthood.
Yeah.
So I want to touch on executive functioning because it is a big part of your work. And I know we have a lot of mental health professionals who are listeners, but just to make sure, could you just give a quick, what is executive functioning? And then we'll go from there.
Executive function are a set of attention regulation skills that there are 4 of them, in my view. Most people have 3, but I have 4. The first is, so it's an umbrella concept, and the umbrella is focus. It's what we pay attention to. And the skills are using what you know, which is working memory. So you can call on your knowledge when you're in a challenging situation or you want to achieve a goal. It's thinking flexibly. It's not just reacting, automatically, but it's being able to look at it from different angles. So that would be cognitive flexibility in researchers' words. The next one I've added, but I think it's really important to add, which is reflection. Most people don't talk about reflection as, if you're a mental health professional or a psychologist, as one of the skills. But I think it is because it takes place in a different part of the brain. It takes place, instead of in the cognitive control system, it takes place in the default network. But I think that's the pause, that's you don't just go on automatic. You don't just react. You're able to think back about it. You're able to reflect about it. You're able to see it from another perspective, and you're able to monitor yourself. And then the 4th part of this umbrella skill is self-control. That is, that not going on automatic, but doing what you need, not eating that piece of chocolate cake would be the usual example, or walking up the stairs rather than taking the elevator if you want to get healthier, whatever it is, not yelling at your kids when you really don't want to. Self-control. So those are the four, for me, foundational skills. And then they are the building blocks for another set of skills, like setting goals, what it is that you want to do and how you're going to do it, or understanding other people, perspective taking, or communicating in ways that you understand your listener well enough so that you can be heard, or collaborating, which is not just getting into a conflict, but being able to resolve problems, or problem solving, which is a very big skill, a very important skill that builds on these executive function skills. And then finally, I don't think of it as resilience. I think of it as the skill of taking on challenges, doing something that's hard.
Right. So it actually is capturing a lot of what we've already discussed in terms of adolescent brain, and then also the parent's role in nurturing the growth of the adolescent brain through things like looking for positive risks, encouraging our child to take positive risks, using the shared solutions framework to address problems. So all of this is really working together.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, if you look at it, shared solutions is when you set the limit, it's meaning making, which is very important as a life and learning skill that's based on those core foundational executive function skills. So it's meaning making, it's perspective taking, it's relational reasoning. You're looking at how things go together, how they would work for one person or not for another person. It's critical thinking, and then ultimately solving the problem. So shared solutions is actually an executive function set of skills that you're using and that you're helping your kids learn to use. The reason that executive function skills are so important is that they are the skills that are most predictive of our immediate and longer term success. And by success, I mean health, well-being, academic success, whatever way you want to measure it. These skills are the most predictive thing that we have in the knowledge that we have to date that will lead us to a life well lived.
Yep, absolutely. And that self-control piece is really huge too.
Huge.
The last thing I want to touch on, I want to maybe quickly practice applying what we've covered in terms of the adolescent brain's gifts and strengths, the adolescent's basic needs of autonomy, and the current storm swirling about social media and teens. So after reading your book, I felt like I had a stronger argument to avoid absolute restriction of smartphones and social media and take a more collaborative approach that would respect teens' capabilities and autonomy. So what are your thoughts?
I think there are times for rule setting, and I think there are times for not rule setting. It depends on your own teen and how much trouble they have giving it up, and how they're feeling about it. So you might say, it's too hard for you to give up, so we're just going to have some rules. And here are the rules. Homework has to get done. The house has to get cleaned up. You have to get your stuff out for school the next day, whatever the rules are in your own life, in your family. So you might say, we're going to need restrictions. And I think that's the parent's role, setting rules, setting limits. Mm-hmm. The structure and autonomy go together in self-determination theory, as you know better than anyone. So structure is guidance, expectations, limits, those sorts of things. I think having a meeting with your child about what the limits are and how to achieve those is really useful. And then setting up what the consequences are of breaking the rules so that you don't react out of anger. And I think we also have to model it. So we can't just be on our phones all the time and say, it's bad for you, but it's great for me.
Right. Yeah, right. Well, and I think to back it up a little bit too is, is there a problem? So maybe even defining, do we have a problem here that needs intervention in terms of their use of the phone and social media?
The best source of what the problem is for me, the report that the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine put out. It's a 2024 report where they looked at, does social media use cause mental health problems in teenagers? That was the question that they set out to look at because there was such a public controversy about it. And their overview is that for some children in some circumstances, it can cause harm, and that social media can be a benefit. And so it's not only parents. I think society, I think media companies, we can't stop the endless scroll. We can't stop the likes if they're there.
Right. There's some systemic changes that would help support.
There absolutely are. I think that saying that it is causing irreparable brain damage for all kids is irresponsible. I think that saying that we're going to outlaw it from children's lives will just get around it. It's very clear that efforts to stop smoking, for example, didn't just happen when we issued edicts against it. They happened when we built on the need for autonomy. So I think that if we're going to do public awareness campaigns, then we're going to have to do them in a way that is respectful of teenagers' need for autonomy. They should need autonomy. That's the stage of life. They're moving out, from us. That's the task, the developmental task. And I think that if we are going to set limits, we have to do it in autonomy-supportive ways. So we can't say kids need independence on one side, and then we're just going to set all the rules on the other side. If we could help children learn self-control with social media, then we would worry a lot less about alcohol and drug use and driving and texting and all of the things that we worry about with, the negative risks that teenagers take. This is a prime opportunity to help children learn self-control, and we need to use it that way.
You just echoed my very same thoughts that this is also a skill-building opportunity.
It is a skill-building opportunity, and we are being so disrespectful of teenagers if we don't.
Yeah, if we just fly in and change all the rules.
Or if we build on the natural need to want to protect our kids by making parents so anxious about it that they're going to flip out about it. I've seen screaming matches that are just caused by the social turmoil over this that is not healthy. We need to use the science, not disabuse the science. And we need to build on what we know about adolescent development. And that doesn't mean there aren't rules. There are rules. There are limits.
Of course.
But we need to do them in autonomy-supportive ways.
Right. And this is a big soapbox, but I will end by saying in the autonomy-supportive language, there's the contrast, which is controlling. And what comes out of anxiety is controlling. And when kids feel, especially adolescents, feel controlled, they are more likely to act out and do the opposite of what you're wanting them to do. And so it's kind of undermining the entire intent of protecting our children if we become too controlling because we're anxious.
It is. And we have a lot of work to do, those of us who understand development, don't we?
Yes.
Because the instinct is to say it's all bad, and this is a screwed up generation, and it just makes news, it sells books, but it's not giving our children the skills that they need to lead productive adolescent and adult lives.
Or allowing them to shine with the strengths they already have.
Yeah. And look at what young people are already doing about media.
Right.
I mean, I love the podcasts. I think that's such a benefit, like Talk with Zach and She Persisted. There's so many wonderful podcasts that young people have created to deal with mental health issues. If we said all social media is bad, this has been such a lifeline for kids.
Right. And there's so much innovation, and they're at the prime time of innovation with how their brains are working much faster than mine. So,
I work with AASA, the School Superintendent Organization, and I go to hear keynotes about how kids are going to need social media skills in the adult world. They're going to need to know how to work with AI. They're going to need to know how to design websites and, create games and that stuff. So I go to some very innovative schools that are teaching kids these skills to use them for community betterment.
Right. So how do we channel the technology to optimize the potential of the adolescents and the technology itself?
Yes.
There was so much we could not cover in our time together. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you really wanted to comment on before we wrap up?
It's just so wonderful to talk to you because you know the research and you know how to apply it. And it's total joy. I could keep going for hours.
Well, I hope this isn't the last time we talk. Maybe this is a new connection.
I would love that.
Thank you so much for this enlightening conversation today. I so appreciate your time and your passion for helping all of us understand teenagers better. and your encouragement for us all to give them more credit and autonomy. I'm sure I will be referencing your book and your work for years to come in my own work. So where can people find you if they want to learn more about you?
Galinsky.com. And I'm writing a lot of free articles that will go along with the book. So if you just go to ellengalinsky.com, every couple of weeks I'm writing another article, and would love to have you subscribing and become part of the conversation. I'm going to be working with schools to develop autonomy-supportive tools and training. And, we're creating an executive function cohort for educators, for superintendents through AASA, where we're going to be developing more tools and training. My other book is Mind in the Making, if people have younger children. That's about executive function skills with younger children. So I've been at this for 25 years of trying to do research, share research, and turn it into action using a civic science approach.
Well, we are all better off because of it. Thank you so much for your time today, Ellen.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.